The first scream didn't come from the children. It came from the cockpit. Then came the static, the silence, and then the crash. Marissa Gray stood barefoot in the hallway of her marble-tiled estate, her phone trembling in her hand, her breath caught in her chest. The words from the aviation officer echoed through the receiver like shards of ice. "Ma'am, Flight 472 from Boston to Denver has gone off radar. We lost contact over the mountains." Her world didn't crumble. It went mute. Hours later, when the confirmation came that her husband, Daniel Gray, the former Air Force pilot turned co-founder of Graywell MedTech, had died in the crash, along with 138 others, including the co-pilot, the attending staff, and the 4 cabin crew, Marissa did not scream. Her body went cold, her heart stopped fluttering, and her mind folded inwards. But the worst part wasn't her own silence. It was theirs. Her 3 daughters, Ava, Ellie, and Grace, just 3 years old. Born on a spring morning filled with jazz music and laughter, stopped speaking that night. Not one word, not one sound, not even a cry. They didn't ask for Daddy. They didn't ask why Mommy was on the floor curled into herself. They didn't ask for anything. They simply went still and stayed that way. If this moment has already stirred something in you, you're not alone. This is just the beginning of a journey, one that will remind you how silence can be broken, not by noise, but by presence. Stay with us. There's healing ahead. 7 months passed. In a house where giggles once echoed through sunlit kitchens and bedtime songs soothed sleepy eyes, there was now only the sound of soft footsteps on hardwood floors and the occasional clink of silverware. The walls still displayed smiling portraits of the triplets in matching sundresses. Daniel's flight jacket still hung behind the door. His coffee mug, chipped at the handle, still sat unused on the counter. Marissa threw herself into her company, into meetings, projections, mergers, anything to avoid the unbearable stillness of home. She was brilliant, fierce, and now untouchably hollow. No one dared mention the girls, not even her executive assistant, not even her sister. It was as if the silence had wrapped around them all like fog. The triplets didn't speak. They didn't play. They only watched, each with wide, haunted eyes. They ate when prompted, sat where they were told, moved only when led. Marissa hired the best therapists, top pediatric neuropsychologists, music therapists, equine therapists. No one could reach them. Some said it was selective mutism. Others whispered trauma-induced aphasia. But the truth was simpler. They had witnessed their mother collapse, and they had locked themselves inside so they wouldn't have to feel that way again. It was late October when he arrived. Not the therapist she had scheduled, not the speech pathologist from Chicago, not even the replacement nanny who'd quit the night before. No, this man was covered in dust, wearing a forest green utility jacket with faded patches on the shoulder and a leather duffel slung over one broad arm. His jeans were worn. His boots looked military. His hair was longer than it should have been, wavy, sun-touched, falling just past his ears. But his eyes, they were calm. The kind of calm that only comes from walking through storms. He stood at the front door, holding a clipboard, the sunlight hitting the tired lines in his face. Delivery from Hartwell Systems, medical-grade humidifiers, and 2 low-temp generators. "You're Marissa Gray." She blinked. "You're 2 days early." He didn't flinch, just nodded. "Mind if I install them now? Cold front's rolling in." She almost told him to come back later, but something she didn't know what made her open the door wider. "Fine. Back utility entrance. Don't track mud." He nodded once. "No thank you. No small talk. Just quiet." It wasn't until late that afternoon that she heard something strange. It wasn't a laugh. It wasn't a word. It was the sound of little feet thumping softly against the tile, and a barely audible gasp. She turned the corner from her office and saw the scene. The stranger, the dusty delivery man, was crouched in the corner of the kitchen, fiddling with the settings on a machine. One of the girls, Ellie, stood just a few feet away, staring at him with open curiosity. Not fear, not stiffness. Curiosity. The other two peered from behind a counter. He didn't look up, didn't speak. But with one gloved hand, he reached into his duffel and pulled out a small cloth-covered object, a wind-up music box. He twisted it gently and placed it on the floor. A soft waltz, clear, sweet, and old-fashioned, began to play. Ellie stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as if drawn. Her hand extended, just barely, and brushed against the edge of his sleeve. Marissa's breath caught. The man looked up. Their eyes met for the first time. And in that single second, without explanation, without introductions, she saw it. He had known loss. He had known silence, and he wasn't afraid of it. Not like everyone else. Marissa Gray hadn't meant to watch from the hallway. She told herself she was just passing by, that her clipboard in hand, filled with quarterly budget projections and legal reviews, was more important than whatever was happening in the kitchen, that she had emails to return, that this delivery man, this stranger with calloused hands and quiet movements, was no one. A footnote. And yet, she didn't move. From behind the archway, she stood, frozen eyes locked on Ellie. Her middle daughter by 3 minutes, as the child stepped forward almost instinctively toward the soft waltz playing from the music box. The man, the one who called himself Jack Morrison on the delivery form, said nothing. He didn't coax, didn't perform. He simply wound the little wooden box and placed it on the tile floor. The music drifted out, lilting, warm, oddly familiar, and he leaned back on his heels, as if he wasn't even there. The girls, for once, weren't afraid. They crept closer, barefoot hair, tousled their matching linen dresses, slightly wrinkled from hours spent motionless. Grace clung to Ava's side, but Ellie was drawn forward, her fingers trailing the air like a leaf riding the breeze. She touched the hem of Jack's sleeve, just for a second, before pulling back as if startled by her own boldness. Jack didn't move, didn't even blink. But a corner of his mouth almost smiled. Later that evening, after the girls were tucked into their usual mute silence and led upstairs by their night nanny, Marissa found herself at the back of the kitchen, arms. Crossed eyes narrowed at the man washing his hands at the deep farmhouse sink. "I didn't hire you to entertain my children," she said. Jack dried his hands with a dish towel, took his time folding it. "Didn't intend to. You were contracted to install the humidifiers and double-check the heating grid. You've done that." "Yes, ma'am." "Then why are you still here?" He turned to face her. He was taller than she'd expected, not looming, but solid. His uniform shirt was worn sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms marked by faint scars and sun. He looked like someone who had spent years outdoors, not behind a desk. "Cold fronts hitting earlier than forecasted," he said. "Generators synced, but I wanted to test the fallback line. If the power drops, the triplets will need constant humidity for airway safety." "That right," her eyes flickered. "You read the note." He gave a subtle nod. Didn't need much, just watched the way they breathe. That silence again. Not awkward, just still, measured. The kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. "You have a daughter," Marissa said, surprising even herself. His eyebrow lifted slightly. "Yes. Is she like them?" He shook his head. "She speaks. Not always to me. Not always with words." Marissa didn't respond. She wasn't ready to unpack that riddle. She straightened the hem of her blazer defensive without meaning to be. "Don't bring the music box again," she said curtly. "It unsettles them." Didn't look like it. I said what I said. Jack didn't argue. He nodded once, calm as ever, then slung his duffel over his shoulder and walked out the side door without another word. That night, Marissa sat in the armchair beside Ava's bed. She didn't know why she'd stayed. Usually the nannies rotated evening watch. But something about the way Ellie had reached out that rare flicker of curiosity made her stay behind, made her want to be near them. Ava was already asleep, a slight furrow between her brows, as always. Grace had curled into a ball under the covers, thumb tucked under her chin. But Ellie was awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for something to begin. "Ellie?" Marissa whispered. No movement. She leaned closer. What was it about him that didn't scare you until nothing? Marissa had never been one to speak softly. In boardrooms, her voice was sharp, precise. She gave orders, dissected contracts, fired entire teams without flinching. But here in the hush of her daughter's room, she felt completely ineffective. She reached out, brushing a lock of hair from Ellie's forehead. "You miss Daddy, don't you?" Ellie blinked. Her fingers curled slightly into the bedsheet. Marissa's throat tightened. "I miss him too." The next morning, Jack returned. She hadn't called him. Yet there he was, kneeling by the backup generator box in the side yard, adjusting the relay with one gloved hand, a wrench in the other. Marissa stepped onto the back porch, coffee in hand. "You weren't requested." "Wasn't charging," he replied without looking up. "You came back anyway. I don't leave a system half-checked." She stared at him. "Do you always take work this personally?" He straightened, wiped his hands on a rag. "Only when it involves children." Marissa's tone softened, just barely. "What was that song?" He glanced up. "The one from the music box." "What was it?" "Waltz number 2. My wife used to play it for our daughter when she couldn't sleep." She passed, he nodded. "Cancer. 3 years ago." Marissa lowered her gaze. The sun glinted off the marble steps at her feet. "I'm sorry." He didn't say thank you, just stood there, holding the rag. The silence between them heavier than grief, but lighter than pity. "I don't know what I'm doing with them," Marissa admitted almost to herself. Jack folded the rag, slid it into his bag. "Most of us don't. Not at first." Then he turned, heading toward the gate. Marissa called after him. "Jack." He stopped. "Come back tomorrow. To finish the system." There was no system left to finish. They both knew it. But he nodded anyway. Same time. She nodded. "Bring the music box," she said quietly. Jack Morrison arrived at exactly 8:00 a.m. the next morning. No knock. No doorbell. Just the gentle sound of boots on gravel and the muted clang of a metal toolbox being set down by the generator, casing out back. Marissa Gray watched from her upstairs office window, sipping her black coffee. No cream, no sugar, just the way Daniel used to drink it. Her finger hovered above her laptop's trackpad, an unanswered investor proposal blinking on the screen. But her eyes remained on the man below. There was something about the way he moved. Efficient. No wasted energy. He didn't check his phone. Didn't glance at the house. He simply knelt beside the generator, as if the entire estate didn't belong to one of the most powerful CEOs in the state. There were no theatrics with him. No "yes, ma'am." No pleasure to be of service. Just presence. She hated how much she noticed. Downstairs, Ellie was watching too. From behind the thick living room curtain, she peeked out cautiously, barely breathing. Her sisters sat in the sunroom, with their wooden blocks stacking, unstacking, never speaking. but Ellie had followed the quiet music in her head. The man with the warm eyes had returned. She didn't understand it, but when he was nearby, the air felt slower, softer, like snow falling in the dark, not loud, but impossible to ignore. When Jack finally stepped into the mudroom, wiping his boots with practiced rhythm, he looked up and saw her. Ellie flinched, nearly darted back, but Jack simply gave a small nod. Then he reached into his duffel. The music box again. He didn't wind it. He just placed it gently on the bench by the door and left it there. By noon, Jack had completed an imaginary final inspection of the generator bolts that didn't need tightening and adjusted dials that were already optimal. But when Marissa stepped into the hallway and saw Ellie standing on her toes, just barely brushing the music box with her finger, she said nothing. For the first time in months, she chose silence too. In the following days, Jack became a quiet rhythm inside the gray estate. He never stayed long. A couple hours, a few tasks. Then he'd disappear again back into the world of men who didn't talk much, but somehow always seemed to understand what needed fixing. Marissa told herself she kept letting him return because of the backup systems, or because winter was coming, or because the girls responded to him at least more than they did to anyone else. But deep down, she knew better. He was the only adult in their world who didn't look at her daughters with pity or fear. He didn't push. He didn't test. He didn't correct behaviors. He simply let them exist in his presence as they were. And that was more healing than all the therapists combined. One afternoon, while Jack was resetting the air vent covers in the second-floor playroom, Marissa stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Where'd you learn to do that?" she asked, nodding toward the vent. On base, he replied without turning. "We had to get creative with heating in Afghanistan. Cold at night, hot by noon. You were Air Force." He finished reattaching the grate and stood up. 15 years. Flight engineer, specialized in system redundancies. You quit, I retired. You don't seem old enough. Jack smirked faintly. War ages people differently. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but thick with subtext. Marissa shifted. Your daughter Lily, right? How old is she? 10. She lived with you full time? Jack nodded. Ever since. Since her mother passed. His eyes drifted toward the window where the triplets were playing silently with finger paints in the garden, their white smocks now blotched with color. She was strong, he said softly. But even strong people have limits. Marissa swallowed, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to conversations that didn't end in transactions or signatures. Vulnerability made her twitch. That evening, Marissa found herself wandering into the kitchen long after the staff had gone home. The house was quiet. Not the heavy kind, but a stillness that felt safe. She didn't realize Jack was still there until she heard the sound of a pan being gently scrubbed. You cook too? She asked, leaning against the doorway. Jack looked over his shoulder. Only for survival. Marissa chuckled a short, surprised sound that seemed foreign in her own mouth. He returned to the sink, rinsing a saucepan. Figured I'd make something simple before heading out, he added. The girls seemed restless today. Thought warm food might help. They don't eat much lately. I noticed. They used to. They used to do a lot of things. Jack dried his hands, turned to face her. They still can. Marissa looked down. You say that like it's easy. No, Jack said gently. I say that because I've seen it happen. He left just after dusk. No goodbye. Just a nod. But when Marissa walked into the kitchen later, she found 3 small bowls of homemade chicken noodle soup covered with foil, and 3 matching spoons wrapped in napkins laid out on the table as if they'd been waiting all day. On the counter beside them sat the music box rewound. She didn't touch it. She just stood there for a long time listening to the melody as it filled the room. It happened quietly. No announcement. No dramatic shift in the air. Just the soft creak of the floorboards and the subtle rhythm of a waltz echoing from the far end of the hallway. Jack had returned. Again. It was Saturday morning, and the staff had taken their scheduled day off. The estate was unusually still. No clatter of silverware. No formal brunch preparations. Marissa had chosen to remain home dressed in jeans and a cashmere sweater, her hair tied back not in a business chignon, but in a loose knot that felt strangely human. She had meant to retreat to her study. Instead, she followed the music. It was the music box again, not playing idly from a counter, but open, cradled in Jack's palm as he sat cross-legged on the polished hardwood floor of the sunroom. A sliver of golden light streamed through the tall windows, washing over the scene like it had been painted. And in front of him, wrapped in an old wool scarf, tied like a sling across his chest, were all three of her daughters. Ava sat on his left hip, her arms draped around his shoulder. Ellie curled on the opposite side cheek, resting against his chest. Grace, the quietest of the three, was nestled in the middle, holding on to the edge of his jacket with two tiny fists. They weren't speaking, but they were smiling. And not a forced grin, not the shy smirks they sometimes gave their nannies. This was different. They were glowing. Jack shifted gently to his feet, cradling the girls with a practiced ease that spoke of long-forgotten experience, the muscle memory of a father who had once danced in a tiny living room to soothe a colicky infant. And as the music played its third rotation, he began to sway. Not dramatically, not performatively. Just enough for the hem of the scarf to lift. Just enough for the light to catch the gleam of joy on Ellie's flushed cheeks. He turned, slowly rocking them in time with the beat. 1 step. Pause. 2 steps. Spin. Ava giggled. Not loudly, but out loud. It was the first sound Marissa had heard from any of them in nearly 8 months. She covered her mouth with her hand, unable to look away. Something inside her twisted. Not pain, not quite joy. Something in between, like the moment before tears come, when the chest fills, but the eyes stay dry. Jack didn't see her standing there. He was entirely present, not for her, not for anyone else, but for the 3 fragile, unbreakable hearts wrapped around him. The music stopped. The room fell still. But the girls didn't unravel. They held tighter. And Jack just breathed. That night, Marissa stood in the kitchen with a glass of wine she hadn't touched. She wasn't sure what disturbed her more, the fact that her children had laughed with a stranger, or that she had begun to trust him for it. How could he do in days what professionals had failed to do in months? She hated the questions swirling in her head, hated the gnawing realization that she was in all her capability, utterly unprepared for this kind of healing. When Jack entered wiping his hands on a towel, she didn't wait. "How do you do it?" she asked. He paused. "Do what reached them. Like that. You don't speak to them. You don't force them. You just move. And they follow you, like they've known you their whole lives." Jack placed the towel down, slow and deliberate. "I don't reach them," he said. "They reach me." Marissa exhaled through her nose, frustrated. "That's not an answer." Jack tilted his head. "It's the only honest one I've got." They sat at the counter for the first time. No staff. No agenda. Just 2 adults, and the hush of evening shadows lengthening across the floor. Marissa spoke first. "When Daniel died, I didn't cry. Jack didn't react. I wanted to. I think I even tried. But all I could think about was the press releases, the transition plan, for the board, the memorial service seating chart. She let out a brittle laugh. I planned grief like it was a quarterly report. You survived, Jack said quietly. Sometimes that's all we can do. She turned toward him. And what about your daughter? When your wife died, how did you not lose her too? Jack stared at the marble counter for a moment. His voice, when it came, was low. I almost did. He paused. She stopped talking. For 2 months. Wouldn't let me touch her. Wouldn't eat unless I left the food in her room and walked away. And what changed? He looked up at her. I stopped asking her to speak. I started listening without waiting for words. Marissa blinked. The simplicity of that sentence struck her like a cord held too long. The next morning, Jack arrived early. No toolbox this time. No pretense of repairs. Just a folded blanket, a portable speaker, and a small, worn notebook in his jacket pocket. He found the triplets sitting on the porch steps, bundled in matching sweaters, waiting. They didn't smile when they saw him. They beamed. Marissa stood at the window watching as he set the speaker down, unrolled the blanket, and invited the girls to sit. He didn't speak. He just pressed play. A new melody filled the air. Not the waltz this time, but something lighter, brighter. A gentle rhythm that made the leaves in the tree seem to sway in time. One by one, the girls stood. They didn't dance. Not yet. But they swayed. Ava twirled once on her toes. Grace clapped. Ellie reached up toward Jack's hand, and when he took it carefully, reverently, she led. From the window, Marissa finally let herself cry. Not because her daughters were healed, but because for the first time, she believed they could be. Marissa Gray had built her life on control. Boardrooms, contracts, quarterly growth. Everything followed a plan. Every risk was calculated. Every variable anticipated. It was how she survived in an industry that rarely allowed room for hesitation, especially not for a woman. But standing in the hallway that morning, watching Jack Morrison quietly sway with her daughters. In the golden light, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: helplessness. Not the helplessness of chaos. Worse, the helplessness of being unnecessary. The girls were laughing now. Not loudly, not wildly, but enough that it filled the air like a language all its own. Ellie had invented a new game, sway and freeze. Jack would sway to the music, the girls copying his steps, and then at some invisible cue, everyone would stop mid-motion, frozen like statues, stifling giggles behind their hands. Marissa had never seen them this alive. She should have been grateful. Instead, she felt like a stranger in her own home. That afternoon, she sat on the bench at the edge of the garden, hands clasped tightly between her knees. I was supposed to be enough, she whispered to herself. She wasn't even sure who she was talking to. God, maybe. Or Daniel. Or just the silence. I gave them everything. Everything. Except time. Except softness. Except herself. She hated herself for thinking it, but part of her resented Jack. His quiet magic. His ability to draw laughter from silence like it cost him nothing. And worst of all, how easily the girls let him in. Later that evening, Jack approached with a cup of tea. I thought you might need this, he said, voice low. Marissa took it without looking at him. You're observant. I'm a father, he replied. You start noticing what others miss. She stared into the steam rising from the cup. Do you enjoy this? What part? Stepping into someone else's life, making them feel like you're the answer to a problem they can't solve. Jack didn't flinch, didn't defend. Instead, he sat on the stone edge across from her elbows, resting on his knees. I don't think I'm anyone's answer, he said simply. I'm just trying not to leave broken things the way I found them. The words hit her like a soft blow. I didn't break them, she said too quickly, too sharply. I never said you did. They stopped speaking when he died, she said, fingers tightening around the mug. They didn't cry. They didn't scream. They just vanished. And I tried. I hired everyone. I read every book. I gave them stability routine. You gave them survival, Jack interrupted gently. And that's what they needed then. But now they need you. Jack shook his head. No. They need connection. It doesn't have to come from me. Doesn't it? She whispered. There was a long silence, one of those silences that feels like a decision is being made inside it. Jack's voice softened. When my wife got sick, I made a mistake. Marissa looked up, startled. He rarely spoke about his past. I tried to fix it. All of it. I researched every clinic. Every trial. I flew her across the country looking for answers. I never sat still long enough to actually listen. Not to her. Not to Lily. Not even to myself. He exhaled slowly. When she died, Lily didn't just lose her mother. She lost me too. Because I was never really there. And how did you come back? Marissa asked. Jack looked toward the house where the girls were now curled up together on the couch, watching old cartoons without sound. I stopped trying to save her, and I started letting her teach me what she needed. Marissa blinked, throat tightening. And what did she need? Stillness. Safety. A rhythm she could trust. Marissa looked down. You're giving my daughters that. No, he said. They're finding it on their own. I'm just keeping the beat steady. That night, after the girls had gone to sleep, Marissa stood in the nursery doorway, watching them breathe. For the first time in months, the three of them had fallen asleep together, tangled in a nest of blankets and plush animals, foreheads touching arms draped over one another like vines. She stepped inside, sat slowly on the floor beside their bed, and let herself remember. The smell of Daniel's aftershave, the sound of his laugh echoing down the hallway, the way he used to cradle all three babies in his arms and pretend to waltz with them under the chandelier, and the way they'd all giggle soft and breathless. She pressed her palm to her lips, holding in a sob. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I thought if I kept going, if I kept them safe, that would be enough. The next morning, Marissa surprised the staff by preparing breakfast herself. She didn't cook, often hadn't in years, but she remembered one of Daniel's weekend rituals, chocolate chip pancakes shaped like animals. They were messy, slightly burnt, lumpy. But when the girls entered the kitchen and saw her standing there, apron askew, batter on her wrist, they froze. Ellie blinked. Ava gasped. And Grace, sweet, silent. Grace ran forward and wrapped her arms around her mother's leg. Marissa dropped to her knees, hugging them all at once, batter and all. I'm here, she whispered. Not just in the house. I'm really here. They didn't say a word, but they didn't need to. From the corner of the room, Jack watched quietly, hands in his jacket pockets. For the first time since he arrived, he smiled, not faintly, not politely. A real smile. The scream split the night like lightning across a clear sky. It wasn't loud. It wasn't panicked. It was short, strangled almost. But to Marissa, it might as well have been thunder. She was already out of bed before her mind caught up. Barefoot robe clutched around her, she ran down the hallway, heart racing in that half-dream haze where instinct takes over and memory hasn't yet formed shape. The scream had come from Ava's room. When she opened the door, the light from the hallway spilled across a scene that was somehow both familiar and foreign. Ava was sitting upright in bed, chest heaving, eyes wide with a kind of primal terror, Marissa hadn't seen since the day they got the call. Grace and Ellie were huddled against the headboard, clutching each other, too stunned to move. And there, kneeling at Ava's bedside, one hand gently hovering near her shoulder, but not touching, was Jack. He didn't speak, didn't shush her, didn't try to pull her close. He was just there, still, grounded, present. Ava's breaths came in short, high gasps, eyes darting around the room, as if looking for a way out from the dream from the night, from the memory that had clawed its way to the surface. Marissa stepped forward. Jack raised his hand slightly, not to stop her, but to signal patience. He knelt lower just enough so that his eyes were level with Ava's. And then he did something Marissa didn't expect. He matched her breathing. Each short gasp she took, he mirrored. Each ragged inhale, he followed. Until slowly, deliberately, he began to lengthen his own breaths, just by a second. Just enough to shift the rhythm. Just enough to offer her a different beat. And somehow, as if her body recognized the offering before her mind could, Ava began to match him. One breath, then another, then a third. Slower, quieter. Her shoulders loosened, her fingers unclenched, her wide eyes blinked. And Jack said gently for the first time, "You're safe." Marissa watched, stunned. Her knees threatened to give out, but she didn't move. She hadn't known what to do. Her own daughter had cried out in the night, and she hadn't known what to do. Jack turned to her. His voice was low, meant only for her. "Night terrors." Marissa nodded wordlessly. "Was it the first?" She shook her head. "No, but it's the first time she made a sound." Jack's eyes softened. "Then it's not a setback." Marissa looked at Ava now curled against Ellie, and Grace calmer breathing normally again, and swallowed past the knot in her throat. "It's a breakthrough." They sat in the kitchen half an hour later, the girls back in bed. The house blanketed in midnight silence. Jack sipped coffee from a plain ceramic mug, one of the few items in the estate not custom-ordered or monogrammed. Marissa sat across from him, her fingers curled around her own untouched cup. She used to scream in her sleep even before Daniel died. She admitted. He would sit with her. Never wake her, just hum until she calmed down. Jack nodded. She probably still hears it. Marissa's voice cracked. I haven't hummed to them. I haven't even sung. Not since. You were grieving too. No, she whispered. I was surviving. That's different. Jack leaned forward slightly, his voice firm but not unkind. Marissa's survival isn't weakness. It's love with its back against the wall. That line, love with its back against the wall, hit something in her. Something she hadn't let herself name. Not until now. She looked at him. Really looked. The faded scars on his arms. The quiet steadiness in his posture. The way he never imposed, only responded. Jack Morrison wasn't a man trying to prove anything. He wasn't here to replace anyone or fix something broken. He was here because he knew what broken felt like, and he chose not to run from it. Can I ask you something? She said. Jack gave a nod. Why do you keep coming back? He took a long breath before answering. I came because the system needed inspection. She raised an eyebrow. But I stayed, he continued, because someone once showed up for me, when I didn't know how to ask. Marissa tilted her head. Who? He smiled, faint and wistful. My grandmother. After the war, I was a mess. Loud rooms made me flinch. People asking questions made me shut down. She didn't talk much, but she'd sit with me on the porch for hours. No words, just knitting. He took another sip of coffee. One day, I asked her why she didn't push me to talk. She said, You've earned your silence. I'll sit here until you're ready to trade it in." Marissa blinked, throat tight again. "I guess I want to do the same for them," Jack said softly. "And maybe for you too." She didn't respond. Not with words. Instead, she stood and moved to the sink, rinsing her mug, running the water too long. Jack didn't push. He simply stood, stretched, and gathered his coat. As he reached the door, she spoke so quietly he almost didn't hear her. "You don't have to wait outside the silence. You can come in." Jack turned. "You sure?" She nodded. "I'm tired of being the only one who doesn't know the rhythm." He smiled. "Then let's find it together." The roast chicken was overcooked. The mashed potatoes were slightly runny. The green beans leaned too far into crisp and not enough into tender. But none of that mattered, because the triplets were at the table. All three of them, Ava, Grace, and Ellie, sitting side by side, napkins tucked into their shirts like tiny dinner guests at a grand banquet, their forks clumsily navigating the uneven terrain of a homemade meal. And across from them sat Jack Morrison. Sleeves rolled, hair damp from an earlier rain, his plate just as messy and imperfect as theirs. Marissa stood behind the kitchen island, unsure what to do with her hands. She hadn't sat down for a meal without her phone or a schedule in years. "Will you join us?" Jack asked, motioning toward the empty chair. She hesitated. Ellie looked up at her eyes, soft, inquisitive. So did Ava. And Grace patted the cushion beside her. It was the kind of invitation no email could replace. Marissa pulled out the chair and sat. There was no conversation, not in the usual sense. No small talk. No business updates. No polite laughter over shared stories. But there were noises, the good kind. The clink of forks. The rustle of napkins. The occasional giggle from Ava as she tried to scoop mashed potatoes with the wrong end of her spoon, and Jack mimicked her mistake like a mischievous uncle. At one point, Ellie gently tapped her cup against Jack's. A toast. He tapped his back. Marissa watched, a tightness blooming behind her eyes. The girls weren't talking, but they were communicating. They were engaged. Present. Alive. After dinner, while the girls played in the den, Jack helped Marissa clear the plates. "You're brave," he said, drying a plate with a striped dish towel. She looked at him. "For making undercooked chicken?" He smiled. "For letting the mess in?" She raised an eyebrow. "Your life is neat," he said. "Polished, structured, but healing's messy." You didn't flinch. Marissa scoffed softly. I flinched on the inside. Jack placed a clean fork back into the drawer. That still counts. They moved to the living room, where the fire crackled gently in the hearth. The girls had curled up on the oversized rug with pillows and blankets, flipping through picture books. Grace had fallen asleep with her hand tucked under her chin. I used to imagine family dinners would look like this, Marissa said, quietly, arms folded. Before Jack asked, she nodded. Before the company, before the interviews and conferences, back when Daniel and I used to talk about retiring early and moving to Montana. Montana. Jack grinned. Didn't peg you for a ranch girl. Marissa chuckled genuinely. He wanted horses. I wanted silence. You got the silence, Jack said gently. Just not the way you imagined. She looked at him, her smile fading. No, she said. Not at all. Ava stirred on the rug and sat up, blinking sleepily. Without a word, she padded toward Jack, dragging her blanket behind her. She stopped in front of him and held out a book. It was Where the Wild Things Are, a copy with frayed corners and a ripped page halfway through. Jack took it carefully. Story time, he asked. Ava nodded once. Marissa watched, stunned. The girls hadn't initiated story time in nearly a year. Jack sat cross-legged on the floor. Ava crawled into his lap. Grace and Ellie, as if sensing the shift, climbed over and nestled beside them. Marissa lowered herself onto the couch, heart thudding. He opened the book, began to read. His voice was low, warm, not theatrical, but steady. With every page, the girls leaned closer. And when he reached the final line, and it was still hot, the room felt like something sacred had just been spoken. A breath held, a wound acknowledged, a door quietly opened. Later, after the girls had been carried to bed, each one whispering their version of good night, with the smallest gestures. A tap on the hand, a nuzzle into his jacket, Marissa met Jack on the back patio. Rain tapped gently on the awning overhead. The scent of wet earth rose from the gardens. She handed him a glass of tea. "Montana still calls to me," she said. Jack took the glass. "You thinking of leaving?" She shook her head. "No. I think I just want to bring a little Montana here. Slower mornings. Horses." "Quiet connection," she said softly. Jack looked at her, then really looked. There was something in his gaze she hadn't seen in a long time. Not interest, not infatuation. Recognition. Like two souls who had been walking parallel trails in the dark and had finally stepped into the same clearing. "I used to think I had to earn moments like these," she said. "Be perfect. Be productive. Be everything." He sipped his tea. What changed? She looked toward the upstairs windows where a faint nightlight glow signaled that the girls were fast asleep. "You." Jack leaned back in his chair, letting the rain rhythm lull the silence between them. "You don't have to do this alone, Marissa. I've been alone so long." She whispered, "I don't even know what not alone feels like." He turned toward her. "It feels like this." And for the first time in years, she believed it. It had rained all night. By morning, the air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the windows of the gray estate wore beads of dew like tiny glass prayers. The girls were still asleep when Jack returned. Not for a repair, not for a delivery, but because Marissa had texted him just 3 words the night before. "Come tomorrow. Please, no time, no explanation, just that." And he came. Marissa was already in the sunroom, a blanket draped over her lap, hands cradling a mug of untouched coffee. Her hair wasn't brushed, and she wore no makeup, and yet somehow she looked more present than ever before. She didn't smile when Jack entered, but she didn't have to. "I want to know more," she said softly. Jack sat across from her, folding his hands. "About," he asked, though he already knew. "You." It started slowly, like peeling layers of paint off an old wall. One color giving way to another, then another, until the original wood was revealed beneath. Jack didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He just spoke. About enlisting in the Air Force at 19. About desert heat and cold meals and letters that arrived months late. About the sound a helicopter makes when it's trying to stay airborne on a bad rotor. About Lily being born 2 weeks early while he was overseas, and hearing her first cry over a shaky satellite call. About Camille, his wife, who had been the kind of woman who didn't just walk into a room, but settled into it like sunlight through curtains. About the diagnosis, the appointments, the false hope, the last breath. Marissa didn't speak while he talked. Her hand tightened around the mug only once when he mentioned how he'd packed Lily's school lunch the morning after the funeral, because there was no one else to do it. When he finished, the room felt lighter. Not because the story was easy, but because it had finally been shared. Then it was her turn. Marissa hadn't told her story in a long time. Not all of it. Not like this. She spoke of Daniel, how they met in college, how he made her laugh with bad impressions of movie villains and drank his coffee black to impress her. how they built the company from a rented storage unit and a second-hand server, how he taught the girls to whistle before they could even write their names, and how one spring morning he kissed her goodbye at the airport and never came home. She didn't cry, but her voice trembled especially when she said, "I used to think grief would make me softer. Instead, it made me sharper. I couldn't afford to feel because I was too busy surviving." Jack nodded. "That's still love." She looked at him surprised. "You kept going. That's the loudest kind of love there is." A soft knock came at the glass door. Ellie stood there, hair-tousled eyes still puffy with sleep. She held her favorite stuffed animal, a long-eared rabbit with only one button eye, and looked between them. Jack smiled and opened the door. Ellie walked in, and without a word climbed into Marissa's lap. It wasn't playful. It wasn't needy. It was permission. Permission to be held, to be close, to trust again. Marissa's arms encircled her daughter slowly, and for the first time she didn't feel like a stranger to her own child. That afternoon, Jack offered to fix the broken bird feeder on the second-story balcony. It was a simple job. A loose bracket, some worn rope. But Marissa followed him out with her toolkit anyway. She didn't want the conversation to end. "You're not what I expected," she said, holding a screwdriver. "Most people expect a wrench and a bad attitude." "No," she said. "Most people expect someone to fix things quickly. You stay." Jack fastened the bracket, glanced over his shoulder. "Sometimes broken things don't need fixing. They just need someone to sit beside them." She didn't speak, not because she disagreed, but because she wasn't sure she deserved that kind of grace. As the sun began to dip, casting the estate in golden amber light, Marissa found herself walking with Jack through the garden path Daniel once designed. The hedges were taller now, the flowers less curated, but the path was still there, winding, quiet, intentional. "I think I forgot how to be someone's person," she admitted. "Not just their provider, not just their protector, but their person." Jack didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was gentle. "You don't have to remember all at once." She looked at him. "Do you think there's a time when it's too late?" He stopped walking, turned toward her. "No," he said simply. "I think the moment you ask that question is the moment it's not." The wind picked up, then rustling the leaves above them. Marissa felt her chest loosen, not from certainty, but from possibility. Jack took a step closer, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of cedar and rain on his jacket. He didn't reach for her. He didn't press. He just stood close enough for her to know. If she leaned, he would catch her. If she spoke, he would listen. If she stayed silent, he would wait. And that was enough. That night, after the girls were tucked in, and the stars blinked across the dark sky, Marissa stood on the balcony alone. But she didn't feel alone. Down below, Jack walked toward his truck, the music box tucked under his arm. He paused, looked up, and met her gaze. No words, just a quiet nod. And beneath that nod, something deeper. Recognition. Respect. And maybe the beginning of something new. The beginning. The storm rolled in without warning. Clouds thick as slate blanketed the sky by noon, and by 2 o'clock, the estate grounds were soaked in wind and rain. The girls, usually content to roam the garden or sprawl in the sunroom, were restless and irritable. Marissa tried reading to them, but their attention darted like birds in a thunderclap. Grace tossed her crayons. Ava pouted. Ellie retreated to her usual corner, clutching her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. Marissa paced. She hadn't seen Jack in 2 days. The lull felt unnatural. His absence gnawed at the edges of her patience. She didn't want to admit how much the steadiness of his presence had become part of the house's rhythm. At 2:17 p.m., the silence shattered. There was a crash, sharp final followed by a gasp. Then nothing. Marissa rushed to the hallway, heart racing. The scene stopped her cold. The music box lay in pieces across the hardwood floor, its tiny gears and brass hinges scattered like forgotten jewelry. The girls stood frozen around it, wide-eyed. Ellie's hand hovered near the wreckage. "No," she whispered, the softest, smallest voice but audible. Marissa stared at her. It was the first word Ellie had spoken in over 8 months. No one moved. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. Then Ava turned to Ellie, eyes wide. Grace blinked and looked toward their mother, unsure. Marissa stepped forward, slowly kneeling beside the shattered music box. "It's okay," she said gently. "It was an accident." Ellie's lip trembled. "I didn't mean to." Her voice cracked mid-sentence. Marissa reached out, brushing a curl behind her ear. "I know, sweetheart." Jack arrived 20 minutes later, soaked through boots, tracking rainwater into the foyer. Marissa met him at the door. "It broke," she said softly. "The music box." His eyes flickered. "Are they okay?" "They are." "But," she hesitated, voice shaking. Ellie spoke. That made him stop. Spoke a word. Maybe 2. Jack let out a slow breath, something between wonder and grief. "I'll fix it," he said. "You can't," Marissa replied. "It's shattered." Jack gave her a half smile. "Then we'll build something new." That evening, with the rain still thrumming on the windows, Jack sat at the dining table with the triplets. All 3 girls leaning close as he spread out the broken pieces of the music box on a cloth napkin. "This is the winding stem," he said, holding up a jagged piece. "It's what makes the music spin." Ava nodded solemnly. "This," he lifted a gear, "is the heart, keeps the rhythm." Ellie reached for it, her fingers trembling. He let her take it. "You want to help me fix it?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Jack smiled, and for the next hour, the dining table became a workshop of healing. Marissa watched from the kitchen arms, folded eyes burning. She'd seen therapists try for months, specialists with charts and games and gentle tones. But it was this messy, delicate ritual of rebuilding something broken that pulled the girls toward their first shared purpose in nearly a year. As bedtime neared, Grace yawned and laid her head on Jack's arm. Ava was fast asleep, curled in a ball on the floor pillow. Ellie remained awake, watching Jack work, still holding the tiny brass gear. Jack met Marissa's eyes across the room. There was something unspoken there, a quiet reverence, a bond forged not in words, but in shared presence. He rose gently, lifted Grace into his arms. "Let me carry them upstairs," he offered. Marissa nodded. She watched as he scooped Ava next to Ellie, following close behind, her small hand gripping the hem of his shirt. Later, when the girls were tucked in and the house had stilled again, Marissa met Jack on the porch. The air was cool now, fresh from the storm. A single lantern cast a soft glow across the wooden railing. Jack leaned against it, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the horizon. "She said she didn't mean to." Marissa whispered, like she thought breaking the music box was unforgivable. "She's not just mourning the box," Jack replied. "She's mourning what it meant." Marissa exhaled. It was their anchor. "And now they're finding new ones," he said gently. She looked at him. "You've given them that." He shook his head. "I've just been here. You're the one who kept showing up." She smiled sadly. "Some days I wonder if I showed up too late." Jack turned to face her fully. Marissa, timing doesn't make love real. Showing up does. That line sat between them for a moment, suspended in the night air. She stepped closer. "You've been carrying all of this with such grace," she said. "But I know loss doesn't just vanish." Jack looked down at his hands, then up at her again. "I carry it every day. I just don't carry it alone anymore." Her breath caught, and for the first time she reached out her fingers, brushing the back of his hand. Not a declaration, not a request, just a shared moment. A bridge. He turned his palm, gently wrapping his fingers around hers. A silent agreement. You're not alone anymore either. Inside the house, on the table where the music box once sat in pieces, Jack had left something behind. A note scribbled in uneven handwriting on the back of a folded napkin. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes after the silence breaks. The Grand Hall hadn't hosted an event in over a year. Its chandeliers had gathered a soft film of dust, and the marble floor, once polished weekly, wore the dull patina of time left untouched. Marissa used to throw fundraisers here, charity dinners, investor receptions. Once it had been alive with champagne glasses, camera flashes, laughter. But now it was being prepared for something different. A new kind of gathering, more intimate, more uncertain, more meaningful. Jack stood at the far end of the room, gazing at the high vaulted ceiling as the string quartet tuned quietly in the corner. His hands were tucked into his pockets, and he wore a simple charcoal jacket that fit too well to be new, but not so old that it dulled his presence. He wasn't polished. He wasn't trying to be. He was real. And that Marissa realized as she watched from across the room was what made everyone around him breathe easier. The event was officially called the Graywell Child Wellness Initiative, a community night focused on family healing, hosted by Marissa's company in collaboration with the local children's hospital. But to Marissa, it wasn't about Piua, not this time. It was about the girls, and about showing them that their story wasn't something to hide. It was something to share, even in fragments. They weren't required to speak. They weren't placed on a stage. But they would be present, and that in itself was monumental. When the guests arrived, doctors, teachers, local parents, foundation members, the room slowly filled with soft voices and cautious curiosity. Some had heard rumors the Triplets, who hadn't spoken in a year, the mysterious man who'd helped them heal, the CEO who'd disappeared from headlines only to re-emerge more human than before. By the time the music began, anticipation hung in the air like the last note of a song waiting to be played. Marissa stepped to the center of the room. She didn't hold a microphone. She didn't carry a speech. She simply looked at the faces around her and spoke from the quietest part of herself. I used to believe that healing was something we achieved by pushing through, by solving, by fixing. But sometimes healing isn't loud. Sometimes it's a whisper, a steady rhythm, a presence. She glanced toward Jack, who stood near the girls. Tonight isn't about celebration. It's about honoring stillness. The kind that happens when we sit with one another and say, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The room was silent, not uncomfortable, reverent. Then the quartet began to play, and something magical happened. Ellie stepped forward. No prompting, no rehearsed cue. Just a little girl in a pale blue dress, her curls clipped back with a ribbon, walking to the center of the room. She turned to Jack, held out her hand. The audience didn't know how to react, but Jack did. Without hesitation, he walked to her, knelt down, and took her hand with a kind of gentleness that made the room exhale as one. Then Grace followed. Then Ava. The three girls gathered around him, arms wrapped around his waist, like ivy climbing a steadfast tree. And then he danced. No choreography, no spotlight. Just the music, the motion, and the rhythm of trust. He moved slowly, swaying with them in a circle, his jacket trailing like a sail, the girls' dresses catching the candlelight in soft waves, and the audience, silent, unmoving, watched a man and 3 once-mute daughters perform a waltz of the unspoken, a story told without words, a miracle unfolding on polished stone. Marissa felt her breath catch as her eyes blurred with tears. She didn't care who saw. She didn't care who whispered. This moment wasn't for them. It was for her girls, for Jack, for everything they had survived. As the music faded, the room remained hushed. No applause, just stillness, as if everyone knew that clapping would break the sacred spell. Jack gently kissed the tops of each girl's head, then guided them toward Marissa, who opened her arms without hesitation. They ran into her embrace, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was holding on to them for dear life. She felt like they were holding on to her. Later that evening, long after the guests had gone, and the last candle was extinguished, Jack and Marissa stood alone in the empty hall. The moonlight spilled through the tall windows, catching in the small cracks of the marble floor imperfections that made the space feel less like a showroom and more like a home. She turned to him. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't say "you're welcome," didn't brush it off. He just stepped closer. "Tonight was a turning point," he said. "For them, for you, for us," she asked, unable to stop the word. Jack held her gaze. "Maybe." Marissa reached for his hand. This time she led. She placed his palm at her waist, rested her own on his shoulder, and together in the stillness of a quiet, empty room they danced. No music, no crowd. Just 2 people learning the rhythm of each other. Learning that sometimes the most meaningful dances happen after the song ends. The house felt different in the days that followed. Lighter, warmer, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. The girls laughed now freely often. They still didn't speak much, and that was okay. Their voices came in fragments and shy syllables, in whispers traded between the 3 of them, like secrets wrapped in velvet. But their eyes no longer carried the fog of absence. They were present. So was Marissa. She didn't check her phone at breakfast anymore. She didn't rush out mid-hug with the excuse of just one call. Her heels were swapped for soft-soled slippers. Her blazer jacket stayed in the closet. Most days, she was just mom now. Not CEO, not widow. Just Marissa, the woman who danced in the hallway with her barefoot daughters. And sometimes, when no one was looking with him. But even the brightest light casts a shadow. And Jack Morrison had started to pack. Not all at once, not with drama, just little things. The extra toothbrush vanished from the upstairs guest bathroom. The pair of worn boots he kept near the back door were suddenly polished and zipped into his duffel. The music box, lovingly repaired, had been placed back on the shelf beside the fireplace, as if it had finished its work. Marissa noticed it all, and it terrified her. She hadn't asked him to stay, not officially, not out loud. She told herself it was better that way. Safer. She didn't want to risk pushing too far, asking for too much. But now the silence she once feared in her daughters had started to echo inside her. One crisp Saturday morning, Marissa found Jack in the garage, organizing tools into his truck. He was humming softly that same old waltz as he lined up sockets and wrenches with precision. The engine was already running its soft purr like a prelude. "You're leaving?" she asked, arms crossed, but voice unsteady. Jack paused, turned to face her. "I was going to say goodbye." She swallowed hard. Why now? Jack leaned against the truck bed, his hands resting on the edge. "I came to fix a generator," he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then I stayed. Because I cared. Marissa's voice dropped. And now you're going because you don't. No, he said quickly. Because I do. She frowned. Jack stepped closer, wiping his hands on a rag. This isn't my world, he said gently. You're rebuilding something beautiful with your girls. You don't need a guest lingering in the hallways. Her heart thudded. You think you're just a guest? He hesitated. I think I was never supposed to stay. Marissa looked down her chest tight, and then before she could stop herself, she said it. What if you did? Jack blinked. What? What if you stayed? Her voice was quiet but firm. Not as a guest, not as a contractor, as family. He searched her face for signs of hesitation, of second-guessing. There were none. I don't want you to leave, Jack. He took a step forward. Is it me you don't want to lose? Her voice cracked. It's us. All of us. Me, the girls, the rhythm we've found. Jack's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the house where laughter drifted through the open windows. You don't know what it's like, he said. To stay somewhere and always wonder if you're taking up too much space. Marissa shook her head. No, but I do know what it's like to pretend you don't need anyone just to survive. I did that for almost a year, and it nearly cost me my daughters. She stepped closer. You don't take up too much space, Jack. You hold space. You hold us. Jack's eyes glossed with something deep and unspoken, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then the garage door creaked. 3 tiny figures appeared, each with messy hair and sleepy eyes, wrapped in blankets like cloaks. Grace rubbed her eyes. Jack Ava blinked at the truck. Are you leaving? Ellie just stood there, silent, waiting. Jack looked at them. These little souls who had taught him to breathe again. He crouched down to their level. I was thinking about it, he admitted. Grace frowned. Why? Jack smiled. Because sometimes grown-ups don't know where they belong. Ava stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. You belong here. Jack closed his eyes. Ellie, still quiet, took his hand and pressed a folded piece of paper into it. He opened it. It was a drawing 3 stick girls, a house with a swing, and beside them a tall figure with messy hair. In crayon letters underneath it read, Don't go. Be our always. Jack looked up at Marissa, who stood behind them now, tears in her eyes, but no fear in her stance. She nodded just once. And he knew. That night they danced again. No music box, no crowd. Just the living room bathed in golden lamplight. The girls asleep upstairs and the fire crackling low. Marissa stepped into his arms like she'd been doing it her whole life. And Jack, for the first time since Camille's passing, allowed himself to truly feel the dance not as a goodbye, but as a beginning. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Because sometimes the deepest truths are only heard in silence. Mornings looked different now. They weren't rushed or sterile. There were no clipped voices hurrying over breakfast logistics, no silent children trailing behind a distracted parent. Now they woke up to music real or imagined, and to the rhythm of small feet padding softly down polished floors. Jack had moved in quietly, just as he had entered their lives, without ceremony, without assumption. His things took up almost no space, a duffel in the hallway closet, a shaving kit in the guest bathroom, his boots by the back door. But somehow, his presence filled every corner, not in volume, but in meaning. Each morning began with pancakes, not fancy ones, not perfectly round, just lopsided, slightly overcooked warm stacks of flour and eggs and care. Sometimes Grace stirred the batter. Ava appointed herself the official flipper. Ellie still didn't say much, but she had a system counting blueberries into a measuring cup and placing exactly 3 in each pancake like they were sacred offerings. Marissa sat at the kitchen island, coffee in hand, watching. Every time she thought her heart couldn't stretch any further, it did. Jack never tried to take Daniel's place. He spoke of Camille when it mattered, when Lily, his daughter, came to visit on weekends, and the girls asked questions about her. They were curious, not morbid, and Jack answered honestly. She liked painting trees, he told them one afternoon, but only in winter. Said they looked most alive without their leaves. That stayed with Marissa for days. Alive without their leaves. Wasn't that exactly what they were now? Not the family they used to be. Not the picture-perfect portrait she had framed in her office back then. But something real, rooted, reaching again toward the light. Lily's first visit was cautious. The triplets hovered at first, unsure how to interact with someone older, more verbal. Lily, tall for her 10 years and shy behind a curtain of dark curls, didn't push. She simply pulled a book from her backpack, sat on the rug, and began to read aloud. Her voice gentle, almost melodic. By chapter 3, Ava had crawled into her lap. By chapter 5, all 4 girls were a heap of limbs, and laughter piled together like puppies in a patch of sun. Jack watched from the couch. Marissa slipped her hand into his. No words. Just this. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, and the house had settled into its now familiar hush, Marissa and Jack stood on the porch wrapped in one blanket, watching fireflies pulse in the dark. "You realize this is the quietest my life has ever been," she whispered. He looked at her. Too quiet. "No," she said, turning toward him. "Just the right kind." He nodded. Marissa leaned into his chest. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Jack exhaled through his nose. "Sometimes. I miss the skies, the roar of engines, the sense that I was part of something bigger." He paused. "But then I hear Grace humming in the hallway. Or I see Ava pretending to be a chef. Or Ellie giving Lily that half-smile she reserves for people she trusts. And I think this is the biggest thing I've ever been part of." Marissa smiled into his shirt. "You're more than part of it, Jack. You're its gravity." They spent Sunday building a fort in the living room. A real one. Chairs stacked, blankets draped, flashlight lanterns taped to the walls. Marissa crawled in first, holding a tray of peanut butter sandwiches like a peace offering. Jack followed with a thermos of apple cider. Inside, with their legs tangled and heads bumping against bedsheets, the girls giggled until their cheeks ached. And then, just as the flashlight batteries began to dim, Ellie sat up straight and cleared her throat. "I want to say something." The room went still. Jack looked at Marissa. Marissa looked at Ellie. Ava reached for her sister's hand. Grace held her breath. Ellie's eyes were wide, but she wasn't afraid. She looked at Jack. "Thank you," she whispered, then turned to Marissa. "And you too." Marissa blinked. Her chest tightened. "We don't remember how to say everything," Ellie continued, "but we feel it. We feel safe." Jack swallowed hard. Ava spoke next. "When you dance Mommy, I don't feel like the world is broken." Grace added. "When Jack plays music, it feels like Daddy's still around. Just in a different way." Marissa bit her lip, unable to speak. Jack reached across the blanket and squeezed her hand. And in that moment, under the sagging ceiling of a blanket fort, they weren't just a family in progress. They were a family, period. Later that night, after the girls were asleep and the fort had collapsed in on itself, Jack pulled a weathered envelope from his jacket pocket. "What's that?" Marissa asked. He handed it to her. Inside was a photo. Faded, bent at the edges. Camille smiling in a field of yellow flowers, her arms outstretched, Lily still a baby strapped to her chest. Jack stood behind them. Younger, unsure, but happy. She told me once, Jack said, that joy isn't a lightning bolt. It's a campfire. Quiet. Steady. You sit near it, and over time it warms you through. Marissa pressed the photo to her chest. "I think we finally built one," she said. Jack leaned in, forehead resting against hers. "No," he whispered. "You did." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying no fear, no storm. Only the song of a house that had once been silent, now humming again. The morning sun filtered through the linen curtains, painting the living room with soft golden strokes. The old record player in the corner played a scratchy waltz barely loud enough to stir the silence, but somehow it was just enough. Jack stood by the window, coffee mug in hand, watching the girls chase one another across the lawn. Their laughter, bright, breathless, unstoppable, drifted inside like music from another world. Once upon a time, this house had been filled with silence that screamed. Now it danced. Marissa entered the room quietly, barefoot, at ease. She paused at his side and slipped her arm through his. "They look like they've always belonged here," she said softly. Jack nodded. "They do." The town's spring gala was that night, a community tradition held each year in the square, under strings of paper lanterns and live jazz. Families brought picnic blankets, couples slow danced on the cobblestones, and children twirled sparklers under the stars. Marissa had planned to skip it like she had the last few years. Too many memories, too much pretending. But this year was different. Grace had begged to go. Ava had already picked out a sparkly blue dress 2 weeks in advance. Ellie, always the quiet holdout, had made her own request, "Can we go?" As a family, the word family had landed like a prayer answered. That evening, Jack helped the girls get ready. He was terrible with hair, but Lily was a pro, and she braided matching ribbons into the triplets' curls with steady fingers and a patient smile. The girls adored her. Downstairs, Marissa stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing the lines of a flowing indigo gown. She stared at her reflection for a long time, not out of vanity, but disbelief. There was a softness to her now, not weakness, not at all, but something open. She had spent years guarding herself behind perfect presentations and polished responses. But now the woman in the mirror looked like someone who had found peace and perhaps even more shockingly permission to be happy again. She turned when Jack appeared at the door. He froze for a second, then let out a breath that made her smile. "You look," he started, but the words caught. Marissa stepped forward, her heels clicking softly. "Careful, soldier. You're going to start a whole new war with that look." Jack chuckled, offering his arm. "Then I surrender." The gala shimmered like something out of a storybook. The town square glowed under a sky full of stars. Music drifted through the air, slow, jazzy, full of nostalgia. Children ran barefoot past food stalls. Elderly couples held each other and swayed gently like trees in the wind. And then came the moment. The one none of them expected. A song played a waltz. Simple. Sweet. The kind Jack had once taught Ava to follow with only his eyes. Marissa stood near the edge of the dance floor, holding Ellie's hand. Jack stood beside Lily and Grace, pointing out constellations above the trees. Then Ellie tugged Marissa's fingers. "Mommy," she whispered. "Look." Jack had turned, and so had the triplets. All three stood in a neat row on the wooden platform facing him. Ellie took the first step. Ava followed. Then Grace. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. A turn. A glide. A coordinated, imperfect, breathtaking movement only a father who had taught them without words would understand. They were dancing, no music in their ears, but their eyes locked on Jack, and Jack, stunned into stillness, finally stepped forward and joined them. His boots moved with surprising grace, not polished or showy, just sure, protective, gentle. The crowd quieted. Even the band faded to a hush. All eyes on the dance. It was clumsy in parts, awkward in others, but it was theirs. A waltz of the unspoken, of grief turned into grace, of silence turned into belonging. When they finished, the square erupted in applause. Jack turned to find Marissa's eyes shining with tears, not of sadness, but release. He walked to her slowly, the girls trailing behind him. "I didn't teach them that," he whispered. Marissa smiled. "You didn't need to. They were watching you the whole time." Later, with the lantern swaying above and music returning to the night, Jack and Marissa stood near the fountain, just outside the glow. "I don't know if I deserve this," he murmured. She touched his arm. "You didn't earn it, Jack. You gave it. You gave them this. And me." He looked at her. "I came here just trying to fix a roof." Marissa laughed softly. "And you rebuilt a family." A pause. Then her hand reached into her small purse and pulled out a folded envelope. She handed it to him. Jack opened it. It was a contract for a full-time music therapy program. Marissa had partnered with the hospital and her own foundation to create a space where veterans could teach children through music, dance, and unspoken connection. She looked up at him. "It's called the Quiet Light Project." "You in?" Jack blinked hard. "Only if I get to build the roof." She leaned in her lips, brushing his ear. "Only if you stay." The next morning, the girls ran through the dewy grass, chasing each other's shadows. Inside, Jack tuned his old guitar by the open window. Marissa sat with her laptop fielding emails and smiling at every ding. At some point, Ellie burst in, panting. "Jack, come quick. Ava climbed the tree and won't come down." He set the guitar aside and jogged outside, Marissa laughing as she followed, shaking her head. This was life now. Not perfect, not predictable, but full. And in a world where words sometimes failed, where grief hung around like fog waiting to settle, they had found something that cut through it all. Love. Not loud, not always spoken, but steady as a heartbeat. And just like the waltz that had changed everything, they didn't need music to dance. They just needed each other. Where are you watching from, friend? We'd love to know what corner of the world you're joining us from today. Share with us in the comments. It warms our hearts to see this community reaching far and wide. If this story touched something in you, even just a little, consider subscribing. We tell stories like this to remind us all that kindness still matters, that healing is possible, and that love often speaks loudest when no words are spoken. Thank you for spending your time with us. We know how precious it is, and we're honored to share this moment with you. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.